Welcome to this Tuesday's Traveling Young. Joshua here, and this week I'm going to talk about Carla Sands' tweet. And if you're Danish, you're probably very aware she is the former U.S. ambassador to Denmark, and she tweeted this in response to a tweet about rising gas prices in the U.S. This is what she said. "I've seen this before. In Denmark, middle-class people can't afford to drive a car. They have a bike, and they take trains for long trips. My ambassador driver would bike an hour in the snow to get to work. That's the future Team Biden wants for Americans. Is that what you want?" Now, a couple points here. First of all, I don't like talking about political stuff, and most of this will be less about politics and more just around kind of the culture and why somebody would think this, because I actually fully believe she probably thinks this is true, and some Americans would believe this, and I think it's interesting to touch on that, and it made me think a little bit about that. But to get a couple of the political things off the bat, first of all, cars are expensive here for sure, but that doesn't mean people can't afford them. Just go outside and see there's cars all over the place. I also think it's super disrespectful for a former ambassador of a country that's an ally. Denmark hasn't done anything. I don't know why U.S. politicians on one specific side like to pick on Denmark as if I don't understand. And as an American living here, it's frustrating to have to kind of like stand up and like answer to this stuff because it's crazy. I mean, and it's just to be given the gift of being able to be here and connect to people, which is what an ambassador is supposed to do, and understand the society where they're living and relate that to America and help bring more awareness to America. And to see that she didn't really do that, to not even understand the bike culture, is just, it's really unfortunate and kind of disrespectful to the country and what an ambassadorship could actually be. And lastly, I think it's a little strange that she chose to pick on the service industry, her driver. I just think that's kind of shows a bit elitist as well, to decide to point out that she had a driver, somebody that was there to support and help her every day, and that's the person she chooses to model this kind of odd, uninformed tweet about. I thought that was also kind of strange. All right, that's all out of the way. But what I really want to talk about, more interestingly, is what wealth means and how the appearance of wealth is in America versus in Denmark. And I think that's kind of the foundation of some of what she wrote, which is, if you're taking a bike, that must mean you can't afford a car. And that's kind of a misconception. And that's probably because that's how some people in America and other cultures would think, but certainly not how they think in Denmark. And that's what I want to talk about on this Tuesday's Traveling Young. All right, I snuck that intro in on you at a point that you probably didn't expect it. But anyway, we're back. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about this idea of wealth. And I think this tweet made me think a little bit about this. And also because I listened to a really interesting podcast when we were driving from Stockholm back to Copenhagen. I listened to a number of episodes of the Kasich and Klepper podcast. If you've never heard of this, John Kasich is a former Republican governor from Ohio, and Jordan Klepper is a comedian, political correspondent for The Daily Show. He has a bunch of stuff on YouTube that's an interesting look at kind of politics today. And they're kind of on different sides of the spectrum, so it's interesting to hear them discuss. But also they're not fighting, they're laughing and being really well mannered about it all. So it's also pretty entertaining to listen to their interaction. It's not about arguing, and it's about listening to other people's perspectives. And they always have guests on, and each of them kind of bring a different guest that they want the other one to learn from. And on this specific episode, the guest was Morgan Housel, and he's a finance expert. And he has some books on finance and personal finance and savings. And this was pretty interesting because he said something that really stuck to me. He said, "Wealth is not what you see." And what he means is when you see somebody have a nice car, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wealthy. What you're seeing is something that took away from their wealth. They spent money on something that made them less wealthy than they were before. Where people's wealth really sits is on statements and pieces of paper and in accounts and investments and things like that. And so it was kind of an interesting thing to think about, which is, I think something, and I don't believe this is just Americans. I think other countries absolutely feel this way, nor do I think all Americans think this way. But I do think there's something in our culture that makes you just inherently think and believe that you need to maybe display something and have nice things to show that you're doing well. And I think, the way that we communicate with people now with Facebook and Instagram and all these things are all about kind of creating a persona around how happy you are, or how, maybe you've got money or you're getting to do cool things. And that's something that I think sits in the West. And this concept of what they talked about, which is wealth is not what you see, really makes me think about that a bit more, and how I think I've changed my perspective on savings and finance and money and what's important to me. Do I care what people think of me or see of what and does it serve any purpose? No. And so I've treated money, my relationship with money has changed since I've lived here. And it's not just because of taxes and all these other things. It's because culturally it's just viewed differently. And in Denmark, this idea is you don't necessarily need to be better than somebody else. You don't need to have something that shows you're better than somebody else. Everybody should have some level of equality, socially at least. And while that's a utopia and not fully realized, in a lot of cases that is realized. And I think it's interesting to think about how some of the root of this kind of tweet actually goes back to this idea that, well, if somebody's riding a bike and not driving a nice car or a car at all, that must mean they can't afford it. And that has to do, I think, a bit about this idea of trying to show and demonstrate wealth by having things. And if you're not doing that, then instead of, the decision that you wouldn't spend money on that, it must be because you can't afford it. And so I think it's interesting to think about that. And also what I think is a trap in places like the US, where debt is so accessible to people, is I think some people demonstrate wealth by purchasing things they can't even afford and using debt in order to do that. And then they get deeper in debt, and a way to kind of display to people that they have more money than they really do. And what purpose does that serve? So it's just kind of an interesting psychological thing to think about, that I believe that there's just something embedded in the culture and TV and everything that just kind of makes you feel that you just need to have some of these nice things. And then the result of that is people see that and they think you're good and they think you're happy. And that's another thing that's fascinating to think about, is this happiness concept, because as a result, I think a lot of Americans believe that in order to be happy, you need to outwardly express happiness by smiling and laughing. But I think in Denmark, we can see that the concept of happiness is more about things like contentment, which doesn't mean you have to be smiling and happy. It just means you have to be satisfied and everything's good. And that's another thing that kind of touches on this. Like a lot of parts of society, I think in the US, is all about outwardly expressing something about yourself versus not caring what people think and just being who you are and not needing to show it in any way. And that's what I think the core of some of this tweet is about a little bit, to me, is making the assumption that because somebody's chosen to ride a bike instead of drive a nice car, they must not be able to have the money to pay for a car. And that also dismisses, by the way, how bikes are just an important part of society here. People ride bikes because it's good for the health, it's your health, it's good for the environment, it's the fastest way to get from one place to another, in most cases in the city. It just makes sense, and the infrastructure is built to support that. It has nothing to do with people's desire to have wealth and show that they have a nice car. And a lot of people actually do have cars here anyway. So I just wanted to make that observation. I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. I wanted to talk, obviously, a little bit about the political part, but also more about what I think is this thing that a lot of people just believe, which is if you don't have something nice and you can afford it, or if you don't have something nice, you must not be able to afford it, versus the idea that you just don't need it. And so you don't spend your money on that thing, and your wealth is actually contained elsewhere in your savings or something as you prepare to have, a nice retirement. And there you go. That's what I'm working on right now at this point. So I just wanted to talk about this real fast. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for watching Traveling Young, and we'll see you later. Bye.